Hello, everybody. We're here with the second talk about the Earth's biotic enterprise. And you'll recall that at the end of the last talk, I mentioned the origin of life and how, even though we have some idea of some of the things that must have occurred, it is still a great mystery how life originated. But one thing that is clear is that once life originated, it changed over time. And this is what we mean by biological evolution. Evolution is the change in the structure, the physiology, the behavior, and the ecological role of organisms over generations, over time. Now, there are two things that any theory of biological evolution must explain. First, it must provide a mechanism by which organisms change over time, a satisfactory explanation of how that occurs. Second, it has to explain how new species arise over time as well. Let's take a look at this. Here we can see a typical evolutionary tree, and it illustrates what I was talking about. Here, this common ancestor of animals and bacteria and amoebas and plants look different than any of these modern day organisms. So that means that over time they changed. In addition, this common ancestor was a single species. How did it come to pass that we ended up with so many species? As we said last time, some 2 million already known species and some 9 to 30 million additional species. So, we're going to first look at how organisms change over time. And there are three mechanisms that do this. One is natural selection, that I expect you all have probably heard of, and I'll talk about that and explain that. Second is sexual selection, which I would imagine that you haven't really heard much about. And the third is chance events, which in the fancy lingo of population genetics is referred to as genetic drift. So let's take a look at these three. They are all important in determining the ecosystems and the species assemblages that we see currently on Earth. Natural selection is a logical consequence of several observable facts. The first one is that not every individual in a population will get to reproduce. Some will not. The second is that heritable variation affects the survivorship and reproduction in the population. In other words, some individuals will have traits they inherited that affect their survivorship and reproduction. Some individuals have a better chance of surviving and or reproducing due to the characteristics they have. If these two things are true, then heritable traits that enhance survivorship and mating will increase in frequency in the population, while those that detract from it will be eliminated. And this is the process we call natural selection. So if you understand that, you understand natural selection. It's logically true if the first two suppositions are true, and I would say those are observable facts. We've observed natural selection in the wild many times, but here's an example. On Daphne Island, my friend Trevor Price worked on several finches, and he discovered that in years in which there were many large seeds, the average size of the bill increases. Similarly, in years in which there are many small seeds, the average size of the bill decreases. And when I say that, I don't mean that the bills actually change on an individual finch. It means that the next generation, the birds that are born the following year, have a smaller average bill size or a larger average bill size. So why does that occur? Because individuals with the appropriate size bill for the seeds that were abundant survive during the dry season better than individuals with the inappropriate size bills, and therefore they make up the majority of the next season's breeders. And as a result, their offspring tend to inherit the size bill that they had. And so we see that bill size tracks what was happening in the environment in the previous year. We also have seen this phenomenon occur with microbial resistance to antibiotics. Antibiotics lose effectiveness over time. And why does this occur? Well, it occurs because bacteria evolved to be able to deal with the antibiotic. By chance, some of the bacteria in a natural population have a mutation that allows it to survive the application of antibiotics. There may be several different mutations in the population that all enhance survivorship when antibiotics are used. Even though not all the non-resistant bacteria are killed when antibiotics are used, the frequency of the resistant mutations will increase in the bacterial populations subsequent to the use of antibiotics. Now, bacteria do not have sexual reproduction, but they have genetic exchange mechanisms called conjugation that cause new combinations of traits to occur in the same organism. So, due to selection, it will become increasingly likely that some bacteria will gain multiple traits for resistance. These bacteria will become better able to resist the antibiotic attack. Over time, as these mutations increase in frequency and are recombined so that individuals have more and more of the mutations that make them resistant, the entire population of bacteria becomes resistant and the antibiotic loses its effectiveness, which explains why human beings have to constantly look for and develop new antimicrobial agents. Here it is in pictures. A group of bacteria exists, including some that by chance have a resistance to an antibiotic. Most of the normal bacteria are going to die when antibiotic is applied, so that the proportion of the resistant ones becomes higher. In this example, it went from being 2 out of, let's say, about 16 to 2 out of 3, so the percentage of that resistance changed. The next generation subsequently will therefore have a higher percentage of resistant bacteria, and eventually the resistant strain will replace all or most of the bacteria, and the population will become entirely resistant. There's some important considerations that I just need to point out at this moment because they lead to flawed thinking about evolution. First, the resistant mutations did not arise because of the antibiotic. They were already there in the population by chance. Occasionally, after the antibiotic is applied, some of the bacteria by chance might mutate and therefore have the ability to be more resistant to the antibiotic, but it's not because of the antibiotic. It would be a random event. The occurrence of the resistance in the bacterial population was not instant, but occurred over time because some non-resistant bacteria survived the antibiotic attack and because combinations of resistance traits in individual bacteria become more common due to conjugation over time. So it isn't instant. A lot of students believe, as soon as the antibiotic is applied, you get a resistant population. No, it's not instant at all. It will take several attacks by antibiotics to do this. Okay, so we have finished with natural selection. Let's talk for a second about sexual selection. Sexual selection was actually first realized by Darwin. He realized that some characteristics might simply increase the likelihood that an individual gets to mate. Sexual selection occurs when one sex chooses the other based on the other sex having certain traits, or when a certain trait allows one of the sexes to have a disproportionate number of matings. Now, in this case, the trait may or may not have survival value. It may just have sex appeal. But how would that happen? Well, as organisms have evolved to become more sensate, we have our 5 senses and we sense things through light, through smell, through taste, through touch. As we've developed the necessary information gathering neurology and then the processing neurology, as that's developed in organisms, it turns out that organisms could just start to develop preferences that are based on sensory input and a random preference, and not on what is actually best for the organism. And I think you could all think of examples in your life where that's true. There's something you like, but it's not necessarily what's best for you. So, for example, female northern cardinals might prefer bright red males, not because the red color indicates anything about the quality of the male, but because the female has an arbitrary preference for red coloration. In this case, the red color would evolve in cardinals simply because of the female preference. It would have no survival, just mating value. So this is another way selection can occur. Now, if red color indicates some aspect of quality in the male, then sexual selection is very similar to natural selection because it selects for a better male who does better in that environment. But if the preference for red is arbitrary, then we will start to see characters in the population that don't make sense from a utilitarian point of view. And this, to me, as an evolutionary biologist, is kind of exciting because it suggests all sorts of new directions that life can go that don't necessarily correspond to pure utilitarian survival value. For example, there is data to suggest that bright red color actually increases predation on male cardinals. In other words, they don't survive as well as the less red cardinals. However, the positive selection of access to mating outweighs the detrimental selection due to being preyed on more often because you're bright red. And thus, red coloration has evolved in male cardinals because of that balance. There are many examples in nature that seem to have resulted from arbitrary female preference. Look at the male peacock's tail, which is such a disadvantage to its survival, but it's a big advantage to mating. That's sexual selection. Now we want to take a look at chance. And chance is a really difficult concept to understand. So the first thing I want to tell you about it is if we look back on the history of life as a paleontologist, we will see that chance events have changed the history of life significantly and therefore have played a big role in evolution and in what we see today. What's an example? Well, the meteor that knocked out most of the dinosaurs was a chance event that gave mammals, which up until that point were just this obscure lineage, a chance to radiate and become dominant in their ecosystems. The climate change events that took out trilobites or ammonites, some of those really strange prehistoric creatures that you've probably seen in museums or nature films, were also chance events that changed the history of life. The trilobites were a very successful lineage until climate change happened so rapidly that they simply could not survive it. And the same goes true for the ammonites. And you should look up what a trilobite and an ammonite is if you can't bring those images to mind. On a more local level, a new mutation that will be selected for and might start to spread through the population because it's really good might be eliminated because of the chance death of its possessor. Or it might have spread a little bit, and then most of those individuals or all of those individuals die out in a chance event. And so that would be another example where chance would change the evolutionary history in a population and on the planet. So evolution is fundamentally historical. It is contingent upon actual random events that occur during history. We will never have an evolutionary science that can predict what will happen next because of contingency. And Stephen Jay Gould used to like to say, if we set the clock back 550 million years to the time of the first vertebrates and reran history, humans would definitely not evolve. It was a set of freak events that led to humans evolving. So that's the idea of chance and what we mean by chance events playing a big role in the history of life. Now, a couple of further thoughts on selection. Novel traits in an organism can occur because of recombination of alleles that result from sexual reproduction or because of gene mutations. So let me talk about each of those for a second. Gene mutations ultimately provide the new forms of a gene, which we call alleles. You will remember from introductory biology that a gene is a location on a chromosome, and then the form of that gene, for example, brown versus blue eyes, which are the same gene, but they're two different forms. And so we talk about a brown allele and a blue allele. The form of that gene can be different. All new alleles arise by mutation. But the amazing thing about sexual reproduction, where each parent gives half of its genome to a new genetically unique offspring, is you get recombination of alleles happening. And so every generation there are new combinations of alleles, and then individuals who have really good combinations can be selected for, and you can get further enhancement of those combinations. They can tend to start to travel together through evolutionary time. The result is that individuals get a genetic structure that confers to the individual characteristics that increase its survival and or reproduction in that environment. Specifying in that environment points out that there is no such thing as a good trait, because the quality of all traits is arbitrated by the environment. It's only once the environment is specified that we can determine whether a trait is good. A heavy fur coat would probably be a great adaptation for a mammal in the Arctic, but would be a terrible adaptation for a mammal in the tropics. Hairiness has no inherent value until the environment is taken into consideration. In humans, loss of hair at some point was a good thing. It must have had some survival value, whether that was through sexual selection or through natural selection. So hairiness has no inherent value. In the human environment, it seems to have been good to become the naked ape. At this point, I'd like to talk about misconceptions in evolution because they are many and frequently made, and it drives me crazy when I see somebody talking about natural selection. For example, saying, oh, old people are dying due to COVID-19 and that's just natural selection and action. No, that's not natural selection and action. Those old people are past their reproductive life. This is not changing the genetic structure of subsequent generations. It's just malarkey. So I want to talk about some misconceptions. Using the model of selection and chance that you have learned, that you will be able to figure out that some commonly held ideas are incorrect. And I want you to see if you can figure out the misconception in each of the following statements and come to our next meeting and ask me to explain them or we can discuss them. I'll go through the first one with you. Only the strong survive. Well, that's not true for the reason that no trait is inherently good. If it turns out in an environment strength is really important, then stronger individuals may survive. But what about humans? We have a specific mutation that makes our muscles significantly much weaker than the rest of the great apes. In humans, there was some reason in the past to decrease the strength of our muscles. A lot of people think it was to support the growth in evolutionary time of our big brain. So here are the other misconceptions. A species or a new trait evolves in order to avoid extinction of the species. See if you can think that one through. How about this misconception? A trait evolves in order to improve the species. Here's another one. Species are getting better over time. And another, humans are the goal of evolution. It's been believed for a long time by humans. And finally, evolution selects the old and sick to be eliminated from the population. And I began with my rant about that, so hopefully you'll be able to figure out that one. That's it for today. Tomorrow, we are going to go from our selection models to evolution, and then we're going to talk about species and how new species form. Until then, study hard.